She was just a girl selling sweets between cars at a red light, invisible to most, forgotten by all. But one afternoon in Chicago, one man stopped. Not out of pity, not by accident. Something in her eyes made him feel, for the first time in years, that the world still held something real. What happens when the person everyone ignores becomes the one person someone can't live without? Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this from? If this story already has your heart, wait until you see what comes next. Let me introduce you to our new app, Allure TV. It's super simple to get started. You log in with Google or your email. In a few seconds you're in. This here is the home screen. Look how amazing it is. We feature dozens of intense, uncensored romance stories, organized by genre. We have mafia, billionaire, forbidden love, and contract romance themes. We have absolutely everything you could ever want. And the best part, no ads and no interruptions. Now look at this. Click here on the audio and start listening right away. You can even choose your preferred language. There's Portuguese, English, German, French. If you prefer to read, just click here on the ebook and that's it. The whole story appears for you to read at your own pace. And you can even interact. You are welcome to rate the story with stars and leave a comment. You can also add your favorite stories to a playlist and access them whenever you like. Do you like what you see? Go ahead and log in now. It is simple and free. You can find the link in the first pinned comment. The light turned red at the corner of Michigan Avenue and Erie Street, and the city held its breath for exactly 45 seconds, long enough for everything to change. Tessa moved between the stopped cars with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from surviving things people never talk about. She was 23 years old, wearing a fitted olive jacket over dark jeans, her natural hair pulled back with a few loose curls escaping near her temples. Her basket was woven, lined with parchment paper, filled with individually wrapped caramel truffles and honey-glazed pecans, each one made by hand in the kitchen of the studio apartment she shared with a second-hand heater and a window that looked out onto someone else's fire escape. She didn't look like someone asking for pity. She looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that pity was a currency she refused to accept. The morning had already been brutal. Her usual spot near the Magnificent Mile had been her corner for almost 8 months. Familiar ground, reliable traffic, a routine that kept the rent from becoming a crisis. But that morning, a woman in a cream-colored coat and diamond studs had stepped out of a luxury SUV and pointed a manicured finger in Tessa's direction. "You," the woman had said, her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "My husband stops here every morning. I've seen the messages. You need to leave." Tessa had opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say to an accusation built entirely out of someone else's imagination. She picked up her basket and walked, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that some battles cost more than they're worth. Now she was in River North, a neighborhood she knew by name but rarely by foot. The streets were wider here, the buildings taller and more deliberate in their beauty. Glass and steel caught the October light and threw it back in angles that made even the sidewalk feel expensive. She had been walking for 40 minutes. Her feet knew it. Her shoulders knew it. The light at the intersection of Hubbard and Clark turned red. 6 cars stopped. Tessa approached the first 2. One driver shook his head without looking up from his phone. The second cracked the window just enough to say, "No thanks," with his eyes already somewhere else. She moved to the third car, a dark slate-grey Porsche Taycan, engine nearly silent, the kind of car that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. The window came down before she reached it. The man inside was somewhere in his mid-30s. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd spent years making decisions. Sharp jaw, focused eyes, the faint trace of exhaustion around the edges that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with a life that keeps performing instead of living. He wore a charcoal suit jacket over a white shirt, collar open, no tie. A leather portfolio sat on the passenger seat next to a coffee cup that had gone cold. He looked at her basket, then at her. "What are those?" he asked. His voice was calm, not rushed. In a city where everyone spoke in half sentences because they were already thinking about the next thing, his full question felt almost startling. "Caramel truffles and honey pecans," Tessa said. "Handmade. $4 each, 10 for 35. He didn't negotiate, didn't hesitate. "I'll take all of them." Tessa blinked. "All of them?" "All of them," he repeated. There was no performance in it, no grand gesture energy. He said it the way someone says yes when they've already made up their mind and simply needed the question to arrive. She counted quickly. 22 pieces. He handed her a folded bill without making a show of it, and when their fingers briefly crossed in the exchange, neither of them acknowledged it. But the warmth of that half-second stayed in her hand longer than it should have. "Thank you," she said, already stepping back. "They smell incredible," he said. "Not you're welcome." Not a compliment engineered to impress, just an honest observation offered plainly. The light turned green. The Porsche moved forward and merged into the flow of Michigan Avenue traffic until she couldn't see it anymore. Tessa stood at the edge of the curb with an empty basket. Enough cash for 3 days of groceries and something else she couldn't immediately name, a feeling that sat quietly between surprise and something far more unsettling. She shook it off, or tried to. She tucked the cash into her jacket pocket and turned to walk back toward the L station. The city moved around her in its usual indifferent rhythm, horns, heels on pavement, the distant construction percussion of a place always building itself into something new. But the corner of Hubbard and Clark already felt different than it had 10 minutes ago, like a place that had just quietly agreed to remember her. He came back the next day. Tessa was setting up at the corner of Hubbard and Clark just after 8 in the morning, arranging her parchment-lined basket with the precision of someone who understood that presentation was the difference between a sale and an invisible moment. The air was sharp with early October cold, the kind that bites through fabric and reminds you that Chicago doesn't ease you into winter. It announces it. She was wearing a rust-colored turtleneck under her olive jacket, the same dark jeans, boots with a low heel that she'd resoled twice because they still had good bones. She heard the engine before she saw the car. That near silent hum. The slate-grey Porsche eased to a stop at the red light, and this time the window was already coming down before the car had fully stopped moving. Tessa felt something tighten in her chest. She kept her face neutral. "You're back," she said, approaching the window with the same professional ease she brought to every car. "I am," James said. He was dressed differently today. Navy blazer, no tie again, the collar of a pale blue shirt visible at the throat. His coffee was fresh this time, steam still curling from the lid. He looked more rested than yesterday, but there was still that undertow of something unresolved behind his eyes, like a man who had everything arranged correctly and couldn't figure out why it still felt wrong. "I finished all of them last night," he added. Tessa raised an eyebrow. "All 22? "I had help." A pause. "My assistant helped with 2. The corner of her mouth moved despite herself. "What can I get you today?" "Same as yesterday." "I don't have 22 on me right now. I make them fresh each morning. I have 14 today." "I'll take 14. She began counting them out. He watched her hands, the efficiency of her movements, the small, careful way she transferred each piece into the paper bag she'd folded from her jacket pocket. There was a competence in the gesture that he found unexpectedly grounding. In his world, most things were performed. This was simply done. "Do you always work this corner?" he asked. "No, this is new." She didn't offer more than that. "What happened to your old spot?" She looked up at him, direct, measuring. "Someone decided I didn't belong there." James held her gaze for a moment. "And do you belong here?" It was a strange question, not rude, genuinely curious, like he was asking something he actually wanted the answer to, not just filling the silence while the light stayed red. "I belong wherever my basket is," Tessa said simply. "That's always been enough." The light turned green. Neither of them moved immediately. The car behind the Porsche offered a single polite tap of the horn. James handed her the folded bills, again without ceremony. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. Tessa tucked the cash away. "I'm here every day." He nodded once, like that settled something, and drove. He came back the day after that, and the day after that. By the 4th morning, Tessa had stopped pretending to be surprised. She made 16 pieces on Thursdays. She'd done the math. She told herself it was good business, a reliable customer. Nothing more complicated than that. But on the 5th day, the light stayed red longer than usual. Some signal malfunction 2 blocks up, backing everything into a slow crawl. And James turned off the engine. He stepped out of the car entirely and leaned against the hood, coffee in hand, and looked at her the way people look at things they're trying to understand, rather than acquire. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "What do you actually want? Not from today, from—" He gestured vaguely at the city around them, the glass towers, the river glinting silver in the distance. "All of this, from your life." Tessa studied him for a long moment. In her experience, that question from a man in a car like that came with an agenda underneath it. But there was nothing underneath his. Just the question, sitting there in the cold morning air, waiting. "Why?" she asked. "Because you move through this street like someone who knows exactly where she's going," he said. "And I've spent the last 5 days trying to figure out where that is." The admission landed between them with unexpected weight. Tessa looked down at her basket, then back at him. "I'm not sure that's a 14-truffle conversation," she said finally. James smiled, slowly, from one side first. It changed his entire face, made him look younger and less defended all at once. "Then I'll need to buy more." The traffic started moving again. He got back into the car, eased into the flow, and disappeared around the corner of Clark Street. Tessa stood at the curb with the ghost of that smile still visible in the air where he'd been standing. She told herself she wasn't thinking about tomorrow. She was already thinking about tomorrow. The rain came in sideways that Tuesday afternoon, the kind that doesn't warn you. It simply arrives and rearranges your plans without apology. Tessa had packed up her basket early, the parchment paper going soft at the edges from the humidity, and was cutting through Lincoln Park when the sky made its decision. She ducked under the wide marquees of a bakery on Dickens Avenue, a small warm place with fogged windows and the smell of brown butter and cardamom drifting through the vents like a quiet invitation. She was wringing the rain from her jacket sleeve when she heard her name. James was already there. He was standing just inside the overhang, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, the shoulders of his charcoal coat darkened with rain. He looked at her the way people look at things they weren't expecting, but are quietly glad arrived. "You cut through the park too?" he asked. "Shortcut to the L station," she said. "You?" "Site visit 2 blocks up. The client changed the meeting to tomorrow." He glanced at the rain sheeting down past the marquee's edge. "Seems like we're both staying a while." There was a narrow wooden bench against the bakery wall, the kind left out for waiting customers. They sat without discussing it, the basket between them, the city turning grey and silver beyond the overhang. A couple ran past under a single umbrella, laughing. A delivery cyclist powered through a puddle without slowing. Chicago in the rain had its own particular energy, urgent and unbothered at once. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have said enough small things to each other that the quiet no longer needs to be filled. Then Tessa said, without quite planning to, "Do you ever look at something for years and convince yourself it isn't for you? Not because someone told you that directly, just because it never seemed to include people like you." James turned to look at her. He didn't rush the moment. "What is it?" She exhaled, looked out at the rain. "Fashion," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. "Modeling, specifically." She paused, then added quickly, "The way people add things when they're already regretting starting. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like something you've wanted for a long time," James said, evenly, without softness that tips into condescension. Tessa turned to face him. She'd expected the polite smile, the careful pivot to something more realistic. She'd delivered that answer to a handful of people over the years and could predict the response the way you predict weather. Not always exactly, but close enough to prepare. James gave her none of that. "When did it start?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My adoptive family used to get these fashion magazines, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar. They'd read them and throw them in a box by the recycling. I used to take them out before trash day and keep them under my mattress. She almost smiled, but it was the kind of smile that has sadness folded inside it. I wasn't looking at the clothes exactly. I was looking at the women, the way they took up space, like they had permission to exist in a way I didn't think I did. The rain intensified for a moment, drumming against the marquees above them in a brief crescendo. I used to practice in front of my bedroom mirror, she continued, walking, standing, holding my chin the way they did in the editorials. She shook her head. I was 12. It seemed enormous then. Now it just seems real, James said quietly. She looked at him. It sounds real, he repeated. Not small, not unrealistic, real. He shifted slightly, turning more fully toward her. I know people in that industry, agencies, photographers who do legitimate work, not the kind that makes promises and asks for something in return. There's an agency in the West Loop, boutique, serious. They scout differently than the big houses. Tessa felt something move in her chest, a warmth that was almost immediately followed by a cold current of resistance. James, I'm not offering charity, he said, reading her before she could build the wall all the way up. I'm offering an introduction. What you do with it is entirely yours. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain was easing now, pulling back to a steady drizzle, the city exhaling. A woman emerged from the bakery behind them with a paper bag, nodding briefly as she passed. The smell of cardamom followed her out. Why? Tessa asked finally. The same word she'd used at the traffic light, but it meant something heavier now. James held her gaze with a steadiness that didn't waver. Because you've been standing at traffic lights long enough, he said, and I think you already know that. Tessa looked away first, down at her hands, at the basket sitting between them with its few remaining truffles, wrapped carefully in parchment, each one made with precision, with intention, with a standard she held herself to even when no one was watching. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. And the rain kept falling softly, indifferently, as if the city itself was simply waiting to see what she would decide. The agency was on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop that smelled like cold air and ambition. Tessa had dressed carefully that morning, more carefully than she'd dressed for anything in years. She'd borrowed a structured black blazer from her neighbor, Maya, paired it with tailored charcoal trousers she'd found at a consignment shop 6 months ago and never had occasion to wear, and her good boots, the ones with the low heel, resoled twice, still holding. She'd spent 40 minutes on her hair, pulling her curls into a deliberate shape that felt like herself but elevated. She'd looked in the bathroom mirror before leaving and thought, this is as close as I get. And she'd walked out the door before doubt could finish its sentence. James had texted the contact name the night before. Ask for Diana Reeves. She's expecting you. You've got this, Tessa. She'd read it 4 times, hadn't replied. The elevator opened into a reception area with exposed concrete walls, hanging Edison lights, and oversized black and white editorial prints mounted at deliberate angles. The women in the photographs were extraordinary, long-limbed, sharp-featured, draped in fabric that looked like it had been designed for bodies that existed in a different atmosphere than the one Tessa breathed. She walked to the front desk with her chin level and her heartbeat somewhere in her throat. The test, they called it a preliminary evaluation, lasted 90 minutes. Diana Reeves was a woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair cut bluntly at the jaw and eyes that moved over people the way a camera lens does, quickly, clinically, without sentiment. She shook Tessa's hand once and didn't smile. There were 4 other women in the room. All of them moved through the space with the ease of people who had done this before, who understood the angles, the posture, the particular brand of effortlessness that is actually very carefully constructed. They wore their confidence the way they wore their clothes, like it had been tailored specifically for them. Tessa stood in front of the studio lights and felt the mirror across the room looking back at her, not at the blazer, not at the careful hair, at everything underneath, at the girl who used to pull magazines from recycling boxes, at the years of traffic lights and cold mornings, at every quiet whisper from an adoptive household that had never quite managed to make her feel like she belonged inside its walls. Diana's feedback was delivered in the same tone she used for everything, flat, precise, unchosen. Your bone structure is interesting, but your movement reads uncertain. The camera wants conviction, not effort. You're trying too hard to be here, and that shows. Tessa nodded, said thank you, walked back to the elevator. She pressed the lobby button and stood with her back straight until the doors closed. Then she leaned against the elevator wall and let out a breath so long it felt like it had been held for years. She didn't go to the corner of Hubbard and Clark the next morning, or the morning after that. She found different streets, Pilsen, Bridgeport, neighborhoods where the traffic moved differently, and no one knew her corner or her name. She made her truffles each morning because her hands needed something to do, and she sold them because rent didn't pause for humiliation. But she moved through those days at a lower frequency, like a radio station slightly off its signal. James texted on the second day. How did it go? She left it on read. On the third day, Tessa. On the fourth, just I'm here. She read each one, responded to none. By the fifth day, she had convinced herself, with the clean efficiency of someone who had learned self-protection early, that the whole thing had been a brief detour, a soft moment in an otherwise practical life. James was a man in a Porsche who had bought her truffles and meant well. That was all it had been. Meaning well and changing something were two entirely different things, and she had mistaken one for the other. She was sitting on the stone steps of the Millennium Park Amphitheater on a grey Thursday afternoon, her empty basket beside her, looking out at Lake Michigan. The water was the colour of pewter, flat and enormous, the kind of view that makes your problems feel simultaneously smaller and more hopeless. She heard footsteps on the stone. Then James sat down beside her. He didn't announce himself, didn't ask if he could sit. He simply arrived, coat collar turned up against the wind, breath visible in the cold air, and looked out at the lake with her. The silence between them was different from the comfortable quiet under the bakery marquees. This one had weight, texture, the density of things unsaid pressing against both sides. He sat with her in that silence for what felt like a very long time. Then, without turning to look at her, he said it, quietly, in the tone of someone who has chosen every word with care. You don't need to become a model to have value, Tessa. The wind moved off the lake. Somewhere behind them, a child laughed at something in the distance. Tessa kept her eyes on the water, but her jaw tightened, and the corners of her eyes grew warm in a way she absolutely refused to acknowledge. Because she was not going to come apart on the steps of Millennium Park, in front of a man she was trying very hard not to need. She pressed her lips together and said nothing, because sometimes the truest response to a sentence that breaks something open inside you is simply to let it land, to sit with it, feel its full weight, and not rush the moment it takes to change you. The letter arrived on a Friday morning, slipped between a water bill and a takeout menu, as if the universe understood that life-altering things should arrive disguised as ordinary ones. Tessa almost missed it. She was standing at her kitchen counter in an oversized cream sweater and wool socks, her hair loose, coffee going cold beside the basket she was prepping for the day. The envelope was plain, white standard, with a Nashville return address she didn't recognize, and her name written in the careful print of someone who had rewritten it more than once before committing. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single folded page and a photograph. The page was from a social worker, a woman named Carol Simmons from a Tennessee Family Services office, explaining that a request Tessa had submitted 18 months ago through an adoption registry had finally produced a match. Her biological mother's name had been Lynette Marie Caldwell. She had lived in Nashville most of her adult life. She had died at 31 from complications of a heart condition she hadn't known she had. She had never stopped thinking about the daughter she placed. That was the phrase the letter used. Never stopped thinking. 3 words that arrived 23 years too late, and somehow still had the power to take the air from the room entirely. The photograph was small, a printed digital image, slightly pixelated. A young woman standing outside a diner squinting into the sun, laughing at something off camera. She had Tessa's nose, Tessa's cheekbones, the same particular way of holding her shoulders, not quite square, tilted just slightly forward, like someone permanently ready to meet whatever comes next. Tessa sat down on the kitchen floor. She wasn't sure how long she stayed there. Long enough for the coffee to go fully cold, long enough for the morning light through the window to shift from pale gold to white. She called James. Not texted, called, her thumb finding his name before her brain had fully authorized the decision. He picked up on the second ring, his voice carrying that particular quality of someone who had been waiting without admitting it. "Tessa." "Are you busy?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She'd always been good at steady. "No," he said, immediately, without checking. "I need—" She stopped, started again. "I got a letter about my biological mother." A pause. "She died. I never got to—" Another stop. The steadiness developing a hairline fracture. "I just needed to tell someone who—" She exhaled. "I don't know why I called you." "I do," James said quietly. "Tell me where you are." He was at her door 40 minutes later. She opened it still in the cream sweater and wool socks, the letter and photograph on the counter behind her. Her eyes dry but carrying that particular heaviness of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has only just realized it. James looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly, without performance, and said nothing. He stepped inside when she moved aside, took in the small apartment with its clean surfaces and second-hand furniture, and the basket by the door, still half prepped from the morning. He sat at the kitchen table. She put the photograph in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. "She looks like you," he said. "I know. Same way of standing." "I noticed that too." He looked up. "How are you?" It was such a plain question. In the hands of the wrong person, it would have felt insufficient. In his, it felt like the only question that mattered, the one that didn't try to solve anything or redirect the pain toward something more manageable, but simply acknowledged that it was there and deserved to be spoken to directly. "I don't know," Tessa said honestly. "I thought I'd made peace with not knowing where I came from. I told myself it didn't matter." She looked at the photograph, but looking at her face, knowing she thought about me, her voice dropped. "It matters. It always mattered." James was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were asking the wrong question all along." Tessa looked at him. "You were asking why she gave you up," he said carefully. "But maybe the real question is what she carried every day after she did." The apartment was very quiet. Outside, Chicago moved in its usual relentless rhythm. A bus, a horn, the distant percussion of a city that never fully stills. But inside that small kitchen, in the particular silence between two people sitting close enough to feel each other's warmth, something was shifting. Tessa reached for the photograph. Her hand crossed the table and her fingers brushed his without intention, just the soft, accidental overlap of two hands reaching toward the same small thing at the same moment. Neither of them moved away. The contact lasted only a second, maybe two, but in the quality of that stillness, in the way James's eyes lifted from the photograph to her face and stayed there, and in the way Tessa forgot, briefly but completely, what she had been about to say. Something crossed a line it had been approaching for weeks, not friendship, not quite. Something that lived in the space between a held breath and a spoken word, something that neither of them had named yet, not because they didn't feel it, but because naming it would make it real, and real things could be lost. Tessa pulled her hand back slowly. James looked down at the photograph again, but the warmth of that moment stayed between them like a third presence in the room, quiet, patient, and entirely unwilling to leave. October became November without asking permission, and Tessa kept moving. That was the thing about her. She had never learned how to stop, not because she was fearless, but because stillness had never been safe enough to trust. So she moved. She made her truffles in the early mornings before the city fully woke, sold them in streets that were growing colder and less forgiving, came home to her apartment with her hands smelling of caramel and her mind already calculating tomorrow. But something had changed in the architecture of her days. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a revelation that arrived with fanfare. It was quieter than that, a gradual shift in the way she held herself when she walked into rooms, a new layer of patience with her own reflection, a willingness to try again that didn't feel like desperation, but like something closer to choice. James had given her the name of a second agency, smaller than the first. Boutique in the truest sense, operating out of a converted loft in Wicker Park, where the walls were exposed brick and the creative director wore paint-stained sneakers and spoke about beauty the way architects spoke about light, as something structural, essential, already present in the material if you knew how to find it. His name was Raphael. He had looked at Tessa for 30 seconds during their first meeting and said, without preamble, "You have a face that tells the truth. That's rarer than you think." She hadn't known what to do with that, so she'd simply said, "Thank you," and listened. The first test shoot was uncomfortable, the lights too hot, the directions too rapid, the awareness of being looked at professionally both exposing and electrifying in equal measure. She moved wrong twice, corrected herself, moved wrong again. Raphael didn't sigh. He simply repositioned her with 2 fingers on her shoulder blade and said, "Stop performing. Just be in the room." She'd thought about James saying something similar, in different words, months ago at a traffic light. "Stop performing. Just be in the room." She tried it, and something in the camera, in Raphael's expression behind it, shifted. The second evaluation came 3 weeks later. Then a callback she almost didn't answer, because she was elbow-deep in caramel at 6:30 in the morning, and the number was unfamiliar, and she'd learned to be careful with unfamiliar numbers. She answered it. The contract was for a regional campaign, a Chicago-based sustainable fashion brand called Meridian that made structured, modern pieces from recycled materials and had built a following among women who wanted clothes with both conscience and edge. The creative brief called for faces that felt real, lived in, present. Raphael had submitted Tessa's test shots without telling her. She sat on her kitchen floor for the second time in 2 months, but this time it felt entirely different. The campaign shot over 2 days in a studio in the Fulton Market District, clean white walls, massive skylights, a crew of 12 people who moved around each other with the practiced efficiency of people who loved their work. Tessa wore a camel-colored structured coat over a ribbed cream turtleneck in one shot, a deep forest green blazer over wide-leg trousers in another. The stylist adjusted her collar twice and told her she had incredible posture. She thought about years of walking between stopped cars with a basket over her arm and said nothing. When the campaign launched in early December, it moved fast. The images appeared first on Meridian's social platforms, clean, editorial, shot with the kind of intentional simplicity that made people stop scrolling. Within 48 hours, the brand had been picked up by 3 fashion blogs and a regional lifestyle magazine that ran a small feature under the headline, "The Face Chicago Didn't See Coming." Tessa read that headline standing in her kitchen at 11 at night, phone in hand, and felt something rearrange itself quietly inside her chest. Her phone filled with notifications she didn't entirely know how to process. Messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, a request from Meridian for a second campaign, an inquiry from Raphael about a national brand that had seen the images and wanted a conversation. She texted James at 11:47, "It's happening." His response came in under a minute. "I know. I've been watching." She stared at those 5 words for a long time, then typed, "How?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Raphael sent me the campaign link when it launched. I've looked at it approximately too many times to admit. Tessa laughed. A real one, sudden and unguarded, alone in her apartment at midnight with her phone warm in her hand and the city glittering beyond her window. She typed, "You should have told me you were following it." His reply came slower this time. Some things are easier to feel than to say out loud. She read that sentence 3 times, set her phone face down on the counter, picked it up again, read it a 4th time. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall over Chicago, soft, unhurried, covering the city in something that looked, from her window, almost like grace. She didn't reply right away, but she was smiling when she finally set the phone down for the night, the kind of smile that doesn't need an audience, that exists entirely for itself, quiet and certain and lit from somewhere deep inside. And somewhere across the city, James sat in his apartment with the Meridian campaign images still open on his laptop, looking at a photograph of a woman he had first seen at a traffic light and feeling something in his chest that he absolutely, completely, and utterly refused to call by its real name. Success, Tessa was learning, had a particular sound. It sounded like a phone that didn't stop, like heels on polished concrete floors in showrooms that smelled of new fabric and ambition, like her name being said by people who had never seen her standing between cars at a red light and would never know that version of her existed. It sounded like opportunity, which was wonderful, and like momentum, which was relentless. And underneath both of those things, if she listened carefully enough in the rare quiet moments, it sounded faintly like loneliness wearing a very elegant coat. The national campaign materialized in January. A New York-based outerwear brand called Vielle, minimalist, architectural, the kind of label that appeared in the fashion Bibles she used to rescue from recycling boxes, had signed her for a 3-month contract. Shoots in Chicago, one in New York, one in Montreal. Raphael negotiated on her behalf with the calm efficiency of someone who already knew what her face was worth, even when she was still learning the number. She gave up the corner of Hubbard and Clark on a Tuesday morning. She stood there for a long time before she left, basket in hand, breath visible in the January cold, and looked at the traffic light cycling through its colors, green, yellow, red, green again. She thought about a slate-gray Porsche and a man who had bought 22 truffles without hesitating, and she felt something move through her that was too complex to name quickly, so she simply let it pass and walked to the L station. She still made truffles on Sunday mornings. Some habits were too deeply written to release. James had been proud of her. She knew that. It lived in the specific quality of his attention whenever she told him about a new development, the way he leaned forward slightly and asked the right questions, not the impressed ones but the real ones. What was the creative director like? Did the concept feel true to you? Are you sleeping enough? That last one always made her look at him a little longer than necessary. But somewhere between January and February, the quality of his attention changed. It was gradual. Tessa noticed it the way you notice a room getting colder, not in one dramatic drop, but in small, incremental degrees, until you realize you've been cold for a while without acknowledging it. His replies to her messages slowed, not disappeared. James was too deliberate a person for disappearance, but they arrived later, with a slightly different texture, more measured, more careful, in the way that care can sometimes be its own kind of distance. He cancelled dinner in February, a casual plan they'd made to try a new restaurant in Logan Square, citing a project deadline. She believed him. She always believed him, because he had never given her a reason not to. He cancelled again in March, a different reason, equally plausible. When they did meet, coffee near his office, brief and warm but somehow surface level in a way their conversations had never been before, she caught him looking at her with something she couldn't immediately classify. Not coldness, something more complicated, something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, like a man who has decided he is standing in the wrong room but cannot bring himself to leave, because leaving requires acknowledging he was there in the first place. She didn't push. Tessa had learned young that pushing people who were already pulling back only accelerated the distance, but she felt it. Every unreturned layer, every conversation that stayed on the surface when it used to dive. The night of the Veil campaign launch was the largest event of her career so far. It was held in a venue in River North, exposed steel beams, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, the kind of space that made everyone inside it feel like they were inhabiting a very curated version of the present moment. Tessa wore a deep burgundy dress with a structured shoulder and a hemline that moved when she walked, her hair loose and deliberate, a single gold cuff on her left wrist that caught the light every time she reached for a glass she barely touched. People said her name all evening. Photographers asked for candids. The creative director of Vielle introduced her to a woman from a Paris-based agency who spoke with restrained enthusiasm about potential European work and handed her a card that Tessa slipped into her clutch and tried to feel excited about. She checked her phone twice. James had liked her campaign announcement post at 7:14 that morning. Nothing since. By 10 o'clock, she was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows with a glass of sparkling water, looking out at the river below, dark and moving, threaded with the reflections of city lights, and feeling the specific, sharp ache of having everything you worked for arrive at exactly the same moment as the absence of the one person you wanted to share it with. She set her glass down at 10:20, slipped through the crowd with quiet efficiency, collected her coat from the check, stepped outside into the cold River North air and pulled out her phone. She opened the Uber app and typed, without letting herself think too long about it, an address that wasn't her apartment. The driver looked at the destination and then at her. Elegant burgundy dress, gold cuff, clearly just left somewhere important. And back at the destination. "Just a street corner, ma'am?" "Just a street corner," Tessa confirmed. She watched the city move past the car window as they drove. The lights of Chicago at night had a particular generosity to them. They didn't discriminate. They simply fell on everything. The glass towers, the river, the old brick buildings, the traffic lights cycling through their patient, indifferent colors. Green, yellow, red. She knew exactly which red light she was going to. The question that was pulling at her, the one she hadn't allowed herself to fully form until this exact moment in the back of a car, moving through the city on the most successful night of her professional life, was whether he would be there too. Not because she'd asked him, not because he knew, but because some places remember the people who found each other in them. And sometimes that is enough. The corner of Hubbard and Clark at 10:47 on a Thursday night was not the same corner it was at 8 in the morning. The daytime version belonged to the city's momentum, the horns, the commuters, the relentless forward push of a place that measured time in transactions and deadlines. But at night, River North softened at the edges. The restaurants glowed amber through their windows. The sidewalks thinned. The traffic light cycled through its colors for an audience of almost no one, patient and unhurried, as if it finally had the space to simply exist without being useful. Tessa stepped out of the Uber and stood on the sidewalk. The January cold had returned with February conviction, the kind that found the gaps in your coat and reminded you it was still very much in charge. She pulled the wool around her shoulders and looked at the corner. The streetlight overhead cast a clean circle of amber on the wet pavement. The traffic light hung above the intersection, cycling slowly. Green, yellow, red. She was not entirely sure what she had expected to find. She was entirely sure what she felt when she found it. James was leaning against the building on the far side of the corner, hands in the pockets of his dark overcoat, collar turned up, looking at the traffic light with the expression of a man who has been having a conversation with himself for quite some time and hasn't fully resolved it. He hadn't seen her yet. He looked in that unguarded moment like the most real version of himself she had ever seen, stripped of the boardroom composure, the careful social surface, the particular armor that successful people construct so gradually they forget it's there. He just looked like James. She crossed the street. He heard her heels on the wet pavement and turned. When he saw her, burgundy dress beneath the open coat, gold cuff catching the amber streetlight, her face wearing an expression that was equal parts certain and terrified, something moved across his face that he didn't manage to conceal in time. "You're here," he said. "So are you," she replied. They stood 3 feet apart. The traffic light turned green above them, then cycled onward. Neither of them moved. "I looked for you at the launch," Tessa said. "You weren't there." "I wasn't invited." "You didn't need an invitation, James." Her voice was steady but carrying something underneath. Not anger, something more vulnerable than anger. "You never needed an invitation. Not from the beginning." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the corner around them. "I kept thinking," he said slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone building something they don't want to get wrong, "that you were becoming someone who belonged to a completely different world. Events, campaigns, Paris agencies," he exhaled. "I didn't want to be the thing that didn't fit." Tessa took one step toward him. "Who told you that you didn't fit?" He didn't answer immediately. "Nobody," he admitted. "I told myself." "Then you were wrong," she said simply. "You were so completely wrong, James." He looked at her. Really looked. The way he had looked at her from the window of a Porsche on a cold October morning, when something in her eyes had made him feel, for the first time in years, that the world still contained something genuine. That quality of looking hadn't changed. It had only deepened the way things deepen when they are real. When I dreamed about being a model, Tessa said, her voice quieter now, carrying the particular weight of something long considered finally being spoken, I thought I needed to change my entire life to be happy. Different world, different people, different version of myself. She paused. I've been in that world for months now. I've stood in rooms full of important people saying my name. She looked at him steadily. And the best thing that ever happened to me wasn't walking into an agency. It wasn't a campaign or a contract or a billboard. She took the last step between them. It was a traffic light turning red. James's jaw tightened. His eyes held hers without flinching. Tessa. It was you buying 22 truffles without asking why. Her voice didn't waver. It was you sitting next to me on stone steps without saying anything for 10 minutes because you understood that sometimes presence is the only thing that helps. She reached up and touched his face, her palm against his jaw, warm against the cold night air. It was you. He raised his hand and covered hers where it rested against his face. His eyes closed briefly. When they opened, the thing he had refused to name for months was simply there, visible, undefended, and entirely done pretending to be something smaller than it was. He kissed her at the corner of Hubbard and Clark, beneath a traffic light that had seen everything and said nothing, while the city moved around them with its magnificent indifference. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not performed for anyone. It was the kind that happens when two people have finally stopped arguing with something true, quiet, certain, and so completely inevitable that the only surprising thing was how long it had taken to arrive. Years later, they would pass that corner in James's car. Married 3 years, her Vail contract long since expanded into work she had built entirely on her own terms, his architecture firm having completed a building 2 blocks away that he still couldn't drive past without pointing out. And Tessa would look at the traffic light and feel something so layered and warm that it still didn't have a single adequate word. A girl was moving between the stopped cars. She couldn't have been more than 15. Thin jacket, worn sneakers, a small basket of wrapped candies held carefully in both hands. She moved with a particular kind of dignity between the stopped vehicles, the kind that is entirely self-generated, built from the inside out, belonging to no one and nothing but the person who carries it. Tessa had the window down before James had fully stopped. She bought everything in the basket. The girl looked at her with the careful eyes of someone who had learned early to distinguish between pity and something else. She counted the bills and looked back up. "Are you rich?" she asked. Straightforward, the way young people ask things before the world teaches them to make their questions smaller. Tessa looked at James. He was already looking at her. That same quality of attention, unchanged across years, the one that had never once made her feel like anything less than exactly what she was. She turned back to the girl. "No," she said softly. "We're loved." The light turned green. The city moved forward as it always had, as it always would, indifferent and magnificent and full of corners where extraordinary things happened to ordinary people who were simply brave enough to stop. She began with a basket and a street corner. She ended with a life built on love that saw her before she saw herself. Some people wait their whole lives for someone to stop. Tessa just needed one red light, and the courage to believe she was worth stopping for. Has love ever found you in the most unexpected place? Leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And if you want more stories like this, deeper, more intense, no interruptions, the link to my app is in the first pinned comment. You won't regret it.